We know that intervention and practices can position a school to support both the academic, social, and emotional needs of students. How have student interventions and support practices evolved over the past few years, the past decade, and where do you see this going in the future?
Yeah, I noticed probably about 15 years ago that schools started to become aware of the disproportionate discipline that was happening, especially with kids of color, kids, that were really demonstrating higher needs in our schools. And it was almost like schools began to, become aware as research was happening that the punitive paradigm was actually doing the opposite of what was the intention, right? To try to teach kids how to like engage better, behave better, all this and perform at a higher level. And really the punitive paradigm that was used for ever in our school systems was actually making many of our students feel like they didn't belong, that they weren't valued, they weren't cared for. And so, of course, it doesn't take too much thought to know that when you treat children like that in a punitive paradigm, they are going to either drop out, ultimately be kicked out, have to go look for their sense of belonging. So I really am, I guess, happy and proud to be a part of a movement in these past 15 years or so where schools are really working hard to change the paradigm into a more restorative paradigm where instead of pushing kids away as a kind of a punitive, we were saying we got to pull them in, but we also at the same time simultaneously need to find a way to hold them accountable, but also hold ourselves accountable as a school community, as the adults. Like, what do we need to do to help that student re-engage, to restore their sense of human dignity that sometimes the punitive paradigm has taken from them? So I feel excited to be a part of this movement. I feel like this whole conference is really part of that movement to really recognize the human dignity that our students have.
No, I'll add to that. I know that the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted a surge for many schools, right, in student behavioral challenges. And nationally, we're looking at chronic absenteeism. And that reflects a deeper disengagement that's rooted in mental health struggles, trauma, unmet social, emotional needs, and disengagement in the classroom structures as a whole. Anthony, I love that you just talked about the beginnings of a shift in the punitive paradigm. And I know that leaders are paying closer attention to the science of learning and development. So I think that this has prompted schools to rethink their ecosystems. They're asking questions like, are we engaging students meaningfully? Are their academic, social, and physical needs being met? And are adults modeling the behaviors that we want to instill in students? In my own experiences, when I was back in the day, when I was a principal at Bronxdale High School, we partnered with the Institute for Student Achievement. They helped us to create what we called then a distributed guidance model. And the idea was that all staff shared responsibility for student well-being. We built a 4-year advisory program, and then we added peer mentors. We built in student advocacy opportunities. We built up mediators, and that helped foster that leadership and support from within. And it meant that there wasn't just one person responsible for student mental health. When I was leading districts, we looked at partnering with organizations like the Urban Assembly and Outward Bound NYC, who already do socio-emotional learning and that kind of work, and it helps strengthen the work of our schools. And it exposed folks to experiential learning programs that emphasize emotional well-being, resilience, teamwork, and really engage kids differently. And I think that those partnerships really have helped shape how we support students holistically and through the evolution of multi-tiered systems of supports and restorative practices. We're seeing some movement. And one of the things that we noticed was that those schools that had already built those strong community building structures and that had these kinds of practices in place, they were able to navigate the return from remote learning with greater ease. And that, I think, demonstrates the critical role of integrated mental health support in daily school life, and the benefit for both the leaders and the young people. I want to continue to see that. I want to see the need to clarify what mental health and well-being looks like in schools and how we can create consistent, nurturing environments. And then beyond schools, what are the policies and legislation that we may need to expand those resources, and underscore the urgency of proactively building school climates where students feel seen and heard and really supported.
I tend to see it similarly and would echo a lot that's already been established in this conversation. I think when we look back pre-COVID, as well as now we move into this kind of what they're starting to term peri-COVID era, and we're starting to pay attention and see how students are really transitioning into this new era and what they're bringing in with. Over the past several years, we've all become much more attuned, hopefully and in a good way, to social, emotional, behavioral, mental health, and well-being. And I think that was something that started pre-pandemic, and then the pandemic messed everything up for everyone. And now we're seeing the need to revisit those fundamentals, really go back to basics and understand that students need a lot of things in their backpack to be successful. I really applaud Sandra Shafoulias from the University of Connecticut and this kind of analogy about a backpack. You know, not only do they need pens and notebooks and academic skills, but they also need skills in terms of how do I interact with peers? How do I manage complex emotions day in and day out? How do I behave in certain situations? And what does success look like, sound like? So that way I can navigate through the world successfully and with ease. All of these things belong in a backpack so that way a student can be successful kindergarten through 12th grade and on. And I think there's more of an attention to those things now, sadly, because of COVID. We're seeing students that really do have much more of those quiet internalizing behaviors, anxiety, depression, withdrawal, and isolation. Sadly, we're seeing mental health statistics climb because of COVID, and just everything that our youth and adolescents dealt with. And so I think when we're discussing the evolution, it's almost like we've gone back to revisiting fundamentals in some really good ways. Before, we would think about a multi-tier system of support where you'd have green, yellow, red, 80, 20, maybe 10 to 5 to 10 at the top. And what we're starting to understand largely in the field now is maybe it's not 80% of our students that are doing okay with tier one. Maybe because of everything that's gone on the past several years, it's more like 60%. And when we have those fewer numbers that are successful, which is the general universal things we do day in and day out, it causes us as the adults to take a look in the mirror, to think about our systems, to think about our frameworks, because we can identify the best practices, but if we don't have a larger infrastructure to insert those practices in, if we don't understand the players in our system that can implement those practices, and ultimately, what are they going to do for our students in our local context? Is this the best practice for these students? Those are all things that we're starting to revisit and conversations that are emerging once again.
Yeah, if I can just add to what my colleagues have said here, I think that when we're thinking about where we've come from and kind of where we're going specifically over these last 4 years, I think we've made some progress, being a practitioner working in the schools. And also, I think if I think more nationally, right, beyond just my local context, in some ways there's a regression happening, right? And there are threats to student safety and mental health and well-being. And so when I think about where can we go? I think we have to be intentional, one, about the sustainability of the efforts that have been put in place on these fronts. So I think that thinks about funding, that also thinks about structure. And it also thinks about, instead of sensationalizing movements and things and terms and things like that, pulling and starting small and working with what does my student need, right? Or what do our students need in this context? When we're thinking about safety and when we're thinking about well-being, for whom? in what circumstances, right? Under which conditions, because that's going to look different. Like when we think about school climate, right? Like we know that I did my dissertation on it, and there are a bunch of theories around school climate, right? In terms of what is involved in that. But all in all, safety is consistently mentioned as an area that's very important. And that's just not a child's physical safety, that's also their emotional safety. And so when we're thinking about these things and ways to progress and move forward, it's important to think about the whole child and that they are more than their academics. They are also emotional beings that we're preparing to be contributing citizens to society. And so when I think about moving forward, I think about sustainability and skill building aside from academic skills or in addition to academic skills.
All of you have really shared quite a bit, and so covered many of my points I was going to talk about. I think the only thing that I would add is this extension of social emotional well-being to our staff as well as to our students, because we're experiencing high burnout and a political atmosphere for educators where it's contentious, and that's impacting our workforce too. So I think, if I just could throw out there, on this panel today are people who could identify the practices that we need to engage in to get there. But the implementation and sustainability of those practices require a way of doing business that allows for a lot of input, partnership, and a co-creation of our systems versus maybe that, the evolution or more historical position where we would have an administrative team or an executive team making decisions for how we do business in schools, where we do have more diversity in terms of socioeconomics, in a number of factors. I think we need to have those voices at the table as we think about our expectations, our practices, our professional development. So our staff who are asking to then implement these things have the appropriate amount of training, support, guidance, and so that they feel like they belong and it's safe to ask questions and they get the support that they need as well.
If I may add to that thought, I think there's also been this increase in awareness of the value of student voice and student perspective. And when you have adults in leadership positions and no one gets into education because they don't want to do good work, they get into education because in their heart, not their core, they're helpers, they're doers. They want to help the youth and adolescents grow and thrive in meaningful ways. And they're all doing the best that they can. And at the same time, there are blind spots to implementation. There are things that they just don't know because it's not their current lived experience. And so the more that we bring student voice into the processes, and as we consider student voice as almost like a data point, as we would any other data points that help us make determinations, then it is ultimately for the betterment of the system and ultimately for the betterment of the students. And I think it's also about thinking creatively about how we involve student voice, because we've all been on those committees where it's the same students that are represented every time. And oftentimes it comes from a place of privilege. Having the privilege of time, having the privilege of resources, having the privilege of even a ride home after, say, a school board meeting. And so we tend to see the same students represented. And it's about thinking creatively about what are all of those other students that oftentimes may come from marginalized communities, and how do we embed their voice and perspective during the school day while they're with us. So that way some of these barriers to participation are broken down.
One thing I did want to appreciate is that, I heard the whole thing about the high burnout rate of our colleagues. I mean, that's a critical problem in public education. So I appreciate that. And I know that a part of it, that because I deal with so many educators, is that, student behavior isn't what it used to be, right? 30 or 40 years ago. And and educators really are not prepared how to engage in what we're talking about, right? True equity of voice, right? Like listening, learning to become from teacher. Let me become a student and let the student become the teacher. You teach me who you are, what your needs are, how I can best develop communication with you and relationship with you. Those typically, honestly, are not part of teacher training. And so they're ill equipped. And then, so what happens is, as we're trying to make this shift from a punitive paradigm, where I guess in many educators' minds, that used to work well. Just come to school, shut up, sit down, I'll teach you the class, and then you'll spit it back out on a test. That does not work anymore. We have to acknowledge that. And because of they were trying to make this transition now where, oh, now we're talking about engaging students and finding out how they're feeling, and teachers are very ill-equipped to make this transition. And so it's causing a lot of confusion because I deal with many schools. I mean, sometimes it's creating camps within our school community where you have some that are saying, let's go back to the old days, and others, no, we need to kind of promote student voice and empowerment. And I mean, it can become ugly in some ways of how even school staff are breaking down in their relationships, and it's becoming more of like a almost like a battle, and it also connects to politics and everything. So I'm just want to acknowledge how we are in the midst of a battle in our schools, because every school I go to, I notice that there's this really difficult transition from what used to be and what we're trying to move to now.
From your experience, what have been the best or most impactful student interventions or practices? Can you share some of the lessons learned from those practices and maybe what you've seen put in place in a school setting that's really worked?
I want to start with building a healthy community and a school culture, including effective discipline, starts by understanding the behavior or understanding whether that behavior, student actions reflect either unmet needs or learned responses. And so at Bronxdale High School, we implemented restorative practices alongside training staff in de-escalation and therapeutic crisis intervention. And this holistic approach, along with having an advisory and having many opportunities for student voice and student leadership, allowed us to address students' social and emotional development with the same level of professionalism as we did their academic growth. By using reflective and structured responses, we could support students during moments of really high stress. And in turn, it ended up strengthening our entire school community. And I did that because I believe that discipline issues can be tackled more effectively when schools adopt progressive discipline models that prioritize positive support and socio-emotional learning. And I think that's the piece, right? Is that it's about learning rather than relying solely on punitive measures. And that those progressive discipline models, like multi-tiered systems of support, really help schools proactively address behavior and provide tailored intervention. And they can be simple strategies such as cue cards on desks or scheduled check-ins and check-outs, assigning class roles where students have an opportunity to be leaders. All of those behaviors can actually, all of those actions rather can shift behavior. And then there are structures like peer mediation or after-school groups and counseling that are vital in guiding students through tough situations and to help them feel like they belong. One powerful example of the impact of that, I remember seeing a student in distress in the hallway, and before an adult could step in, a peer mentor who had been actually leading advisory sessions for freshmen stepped in saying, "Don't worry, I've got them. They're my freshmen." And that's the kind of response that prevents escalation and fosters a caring school community. You heard Courtney and Anthony say that it's crucial that school personnel, including our school safety agents, where those are available, are equipped with research-backed best practices, that they learn how to teach behavioral and socio-emotional skills, and that they get the support that they need, but they also have a voice in deciding what gets implemented in a school. In New York City, the Department of Education's Office of Safety and Youth Development has invested in training educators to develop and to deliver tiered academic and behavioral interventions. And I feel like when the adults are better prepared, we're going to get better at guiding students in managing emotions, in developing empathy, in establishing relationships, which is really important throughout their school career, and in making responsible decisions. And then the last piece I want to just emphasize that I think is a really good strategy as well, and it's a strategy of the adults, and it goes back to what Dr. Carr was saying about how you build sustainability. And that's that partnerships are key in this work. I'm such an advocate for community schools in part because of that, right? That partnerships with organizations like The Door or Center for Supportive Schools or Good Shepherd Services in New York City have helped to build a positive school culture. And these partners, they help leaders to set a positive tone, to monitor attendance, to provide engaging, healthy, fun activities outside of school hours. And what that does is it also frees up school staff to focus on the students directly in front of them. I think that's really important, is it lets them have the opportunity to do the work they need to do, thinking about each individual student, because other pieces are being co-facilitated with the support of folks. And so initiatives like the Chancellor's New York City Project Pivot, which brings mental health counseling, mentoring, and even recreational learning to the schools, are crucial for supporting students academically and emotionally. And so I think that with the right mindset, with the right staffing, with the sustained support, that schools can not just reduce disciplinary incidents, but they can foster a culture of safety, of inclusivity, and then provide the much needed mental health support and well-being, particularly in the wake of the pandemic.
Yeah, I can try to follow that, but that was really well said. I think I wanted to share 4 points, and this is with assuming we have a strong tier one and we've done a lot of work in establishing a positive culture and climate. So my 4 points. One is this idea that interventions involve planning with the student and the caregivers and not for them. And I'll just give one quick example. And this example involves a second grader where a team was meeting and they invited the second grader to join the team meeting. He was a member of the team. And we were talking about an intervention idea where he would go upstairs and receive a little extra help. And it was really about changing the setting so that he could have a quieter setting. And that was the idea that we were running with. And he said, "Oh, no, that won't work. I don't like to go upstairs. That's where my sister is. And that's not going to work for me." And so by the end of the meeting, although it was just a simple, statement on his part, we were able to take his feedback and enter that into the end plan. And he felt heard, he felt validated, and he ended up participating in this intervention that he helped create, that he knew he needed. And so the investment was really high. So I think in that way, sometimes a really good interventionist is someone that is a really good listener. And so can we think about listening to the families and who are sharing their concerns, or listening to the student instead of reacting based on something that's happened, really approach it with with the motivation of understanding. And in that way, point 2 is that we're looking at the why of a behavior or the function of the behavior versus the topography of the behavior, meaning just what it looks like or just what it sounds like. So I think out the door goes these codes of conduct where, if you have this infraction, it equals that kind of a consequence. And instead, we're trying to understand the motivation of the behavior so that we can then, in a responsive way, problem solve it and support that through whatever needs to be taught or whatever arrangements need to be made in the environment. So the function versus the topography of the behavior. Third point is understanding that interventions in tier 2 and tier 3, where students need a little something more or maybe something very individualized, is that this is going to involve adult behavior change. So we're looking at the behavior change of the adults, and change is hard. So as we come together and we talk about what needs to happen, there's a ground rule or an expectation that's set as we meet that we may all be asked to change how we have historically interacted with this individual or with our classroom, and that we embrace that change is hard and we are ready to support the implementers and help them problem solve and check back in, and that there's a coaching and support infrastructure that goes along with just intervention planning. Then my last point kind of follows that third point, which is we need to be looking at the social validity of the implementation and ensuring that those educators that we're asking to change understand the why behind it so that they have buy-in for it, and they can also see the long game of we might not see change right away, but there's a reason here why we're asking you to do the things we're asking, but that the educator then has a chance to come back and ask about what kind of accommodations they may need, and can really envision themselves implementing this. And that when they encounter barriers, there's again that team that can help them work through those situations. So those are my 4 points. There's much more that we could, in terms of individual practices, but I think you need the infrastructure, which is supportive, it's team-based, it honors the voice of the student and their family, and then the teachers are feeling some self-efficacy around the implementation.
What has been said, like really powerful messages, and I'm grateful for that. I heard this power of listening to understand, and in the trainings that I've provided, I try to implement this concept that as educators, if we're going to be effective educators, at least, we need to be humble. Now, humility is not the easiest thing to teach. It's something that oftentimes is taught to us from our parents and grandparents. It's like something deeply seated in us. And so it's a very different kind of way to be in relationship. And so, if you're into power over people, that's not going to work too well for you. But if you decide, I want to approach these students, for example, as like my teachers, that they are my teachers in some ways. If I want to gain cultural competence, it's not that I went and read a book on it, it's that I actually listened to my students, who they are, what is their experience, and then I begin to connect my human experience with their human experience. That is the restorative paradigm. And does it take time? Yes. Is there like an alternative to it? No, there's not. You have to take time to listen, to gain understanding, have enough humility to say, I need to learn who these people are, and I need to find appropriate ways to show that they're like me, I'm like them. Um, when we begin to humanize in that way, that then starts to build relationship. The more we kind of use this sort of like oppressive power over people, that's really built on what we call colonialism. That's like that's an old paradigm that is proven to just alienate people and harm communities, stereotype people. We're about saying, how can we break down stereotypes? The way you break down stereotypes is listen to people, let them tell you their story, and then you learn to acknowledge with gratitude, right? Maybe their experience is hard and painful, and you say, thank you for sharing that with me, for trusting me enough. And when you were speaking, it even reminded me that, yeah, I can relate in some ways to you, or maybe I can't relate. Maybe I come from what was said earlier, a privilege. I didn't suffer those things, but I want you to know this: in this school community, I have your back no matter what. When you come to this school, you come with your authentic self, and I guarantee you, through me, I will embrace you as that. Not like, oh, I wish you were up here and this, reaching all the standards. And no, no, you come as you are, and through me, you will experience the embrace to feel like you're completely accepted as you are. I believe that is like almost like the foundation of a lot of what we call healthy human relationship.
There's been so many great thoughts that have been introduced to this conversation, and they kind of allow me to enter into it from a different angle, from a different vantage point, if you will. So here at the National Threat Assessment Center, a lot of our work, especially when we think about K-12 settings, is focused on preventing acts of targeted violence in schools and really thinking about how do we help the adults in the environment work through understanding, does an individual pose a risk of harm to themselves or to other members of the school community, and then thinking about what can we do to support that individual and really almost wrapping around that individual to support them to a greater level of success or to enhance their quality of life, quite honestly. And so when I think about that and the conversations that are emerging here, where my mind goes is climate and culture, where we think about, who are we as a school or who are we as a district? And one thing that unites us all, this common thread that runs through us as humans, is this innate need to be seen and heard. Do you see me? Do you hear me? Does what I say mean anything to you? And it's the same for the youth and adolescents that we work with day in and day out. There's this innate sense to be seen and to be heard and to be valued. And what we know from the research that we've done on completed attacks in schools, as well as those attacks that were ultimately plotted and averted, is that climate and culture matters. When students feel that there's somebody on that campus that they have a supported, trusted, respected relationship with, and I'm talking about the adults there, then they feel way more comfortable going and saying, hey, I'm noticing X, Y, and Z with a classmate or a peer, and I'm concerned. Or I saw this thing on social media, and I'm not sure what to do with it. Can you help me with that? When those types of relationships exist, we know that people come forward. And when people come forward, then opportunities expand to avert acts of harm. And in the absence of such relationships, sadly, we know that people stay quiet and they stay silent. And so when I think about schools, being a trained educator and administrator myself, and especially working across the country and say even rural communities, I always think about what can we do tomorrow? What can I go back to my building? What can I go back to my classroom and start implementing right away? And what I would offer to this conversation is the evidence-based practice of active supervision. It's completely free and it's ready to implement for any school or district. And it's simply what it is, actively supervising. And you can break it down in terms of, I'm going to move, I'm going to scan, and I'm going to interact. And I'm interacting to build those relationships, to build that rapport. It can be something as simple as, wow, I'm so glad that you're here today. Or that's a cool backpack. Where did you get that? Or what did you have for dinner last night? Or what's on dock for you this weekend? Little things like that show students that they are seen. And then over time, it gives the opportunity to build those relationships. And when schools repurpose that intervention or that practice of active supervision, it's going to have a direct impact on climate and culture. And then we see hosts of positive benefits coming from that. I've also worked with schools where they, right before Thanksgiving break, they make sure that every child in that high school receives a handwritten note from one of the educators, one of the staff members, so that before they leave for break, they've got something that they're taking with them that indicates to them, I'm seen, I'm valued. Somebody knows that I'm in this building and is excited for me to come back. Or at the beginning of the school year, even having a whiteboard in the administrative conference room where everybody is putting their garage sale dot, if you will, or their post-it note next to student names. So that way, as a faculty, they can step back, have that balcony level view and see which students clearly have points of connection with us and which students don't. and then prioritizing those students that don't have those points of connection and making concerted efforts to build them. Because when we build those points of connection, we positively impact climate and culture, which has a direct impact on safety.
I just want to add to that, I want to emphasize the leader's role in signaling and building that climate and culture, particularly given that we're educators and we have a range of different folks who are here. But the leader really plays a role, not just in signaling what matters to them and to the school through their actions and strategic plans. So, investing in training teachers, hiring additional social workers, establishing restorative coaches, all of that signals to the community what really matters. But then there's that piece about being seen and valued that you have all been talking about that's earned through, I love that you brought up, Anthony, humility. And I think it's really important for the leader not only to be part of all of those trainings and to be part of those activities, but also to then be able to practice some of that learning and that change. I love, Courtney, you had mentioned that one of the big pieces, I think it was number 3, right? That in order for these interventions to work, there needs to be a change in adult behavior. And I think the leader actually has to signal that. I remember having a coach tell me that if I really wanted to build, make mistake making part of my culture in the school and make it okay and part of learning, I had to model that. And as a principal at the time, that was a really difficult thing to model in front of staff. And so we practiced having me at morning meetings be able to say, hey, I made this decision or I did this thing. It didn't work because of this particular reason. Here's how we're going to move through that so that we could help normalize some of that. And that happened with the students as well. When we were being trained on collaborative problem solving, I let a student know I'm learning this process so that I can better engage with you. Let's give it a shot. And it lessened the student's frustration. It helped the student understand why we were going through the actions that we were going through. But then I also had an opportunity to make sure that the student felt valued and heard. And so as a leader, really paying attention to what are the actions and what are the pieces that you're putting in place? What are the resources and how are you investing that are actually letting folks know that this is the kind of community that you want to build?
Dr. Morris, I'd really like to get your thoughts on this. Can we talk more about some of the more targeted or individualized forms of support that schools may need to implement for students that, for a range of reasons, have a higher need?
Yes, and the way that I want to begin this conversation for our group is with the encouragement that when we think about a school, I am hoping we're thinking about a multidisciplinary team, that we're thinking about a team of individuals with a range of expertise and experience that are tapping into their collective intelligence to really mastermind and think about how do we support this student to a better quality of life? How do we support them to new and different ways? I think one of the worst things that we can do, and this is coming from, background as an administrator myself, is make decisions in isolation, where I look very quickly at the facts of a situation or what I believe to be the facts, and I make a snap decision right then in the moment based upon what's only in front of me. I think when we make those types of decisions, they're shallow, and we need to go deeper. And we can achieve that deeper decision making through having that team with, as I said, a range of expertise and experiences. And when they're doing that, really thinking about not just, and our colleague on the panel earlier described the topography, and I love that word, the topography of a behavior. What's it look like? What's it sound like? And I'm so thankful that in our conversations today, we've started to dig deeper and address the why, because at its core, behavior is a form of communication. It's communicating something that they're either trying to get or trying to avoid. There's something going on in their context. And as much as we want to talk about practices, I'm going to talk about systems. How do we have these larger systems in place to support staff? Because it's practices that they then use to support students, and then hopefully data that they're keeping their fingers on the pulse of to make decisions. And I think when you have that synergy between systems, practices, and data, we can start to do a lot of really good work for students. And unfortunately, in my line of work, when we think about students that have those intensive individualized needs, those are also wrapped into concerns for harm to themselves or harm to others. And when you've got that that team approach to problem solving and using collective intelligence and really thinking broadly about who this student is and really challenging themselves to think holistically. What information can we use that tells us what home's like for them? What's academics like for them? What are their peer relationships like for them? What's their online presence like for them? All of these things that help us better understand who is this person? What is their experience? And what can we do to support them as they navigate through distressing times ultimately? And then putting a plan in place. And it begins by thinking about what do we already have access to? A lot of the schools in our country are rural in nature. And so they have to think clever in terms of what can I get? Because I might not have direct mental health access within my local community. It could be an hour or two away. And then we also have schools that I've got a clinician, not only in the community, but they're part of our tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 teams. And either way's okay because that's the reality that schools face. But it's thinking about what do we already have access to? How do we start to expand that? How do we build these partnerships so we can bring more in? And I love the conversations that have emerged today about adult behavior, because adult behavior does equal student change. We do have to think differently. We do have to operate differently. And when we keep student change at the forefront of our thinking, we'll get there.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from the other panelists on this topic and your experiences for those students with individualized, highly complex needs.
I would love to piggyback on what was just said. And I'd like to go, the question is an advanced tiers question. It's about students who need something more, but I want to move us back a little bit to a tier 1 universal expectation that I have for staff or for those professionals that are going to be supporting and providing interventions. And I wanted to piggyback because I think it goes off of the point of this should be team-based. And I have a rule, and it typically goes on expectation matrices in these kinds of team meetings where it's the first thing we talk about, and that is that we will only talk in ways about students and their families in a manner that we would if they were sitting at the table with us. Right? So we're not going to say anything that we wouldn't say if they were at the table with us. And so that comes first, is this mindset of constant positive regard. And that does take a little coaching, because if we're honest, some behavioral sometimes when students engage in these behavioral responses, they're hitting emotional triggers in us and we react because we're human. So coming together in a team and able to just kind of shake it off and remember that the student's still learning, that they still have a family that's invested, and starting from that place. And sometimes that takes setting the table for that to happen. But the idea of a team base, I have worked in schools, and I also support building these systems in schools and districts and regions and now statewide. But I would like to now try to answer this question as a mom. I have 6 children. 2 of them have multiple disabilities, and we are navigating multiple systems of care. So we have school teams, we have medical teams, we have home supports, community supports, and each one of those systems has a case manager and has, professionals that are supported to providing those supports. And each case manager is someone that I have to coordinate care with. And so when we, just to back it up, when we think about these school team meetings, a lot of them are going to result in a behavior plan or a safety plan that is redundant and duplicated, but sometimes with separate practices that are contradictory. So the idea of wrapping around or creating an integrated systems framework where we can bring voices from all of those different players. And we can do that. We can get representation from the medical team and the home supports to sit at the table with us That's the ideal, is to look at the whole child, but also to support the family and supporting the child too. So I think that's a big one for me. And some of the other things have already been stated. It's going back to the why. Why is this happening? And skill building. But one point I'd like to add on is leveraging the students' strengths. So many times we're looking at this deficit model of what can't they do and how do we help them. And if we can, take a different approach where what are they good at? What do they feel strong about? And make sure that that's included in the plan so they have a chance to shine or to show it off or to feel confident. And keeping with the backpack reference that was shared earlier is I want students to leave their school day feeling like they have a backpack full of success. So what does that look like? And how can we engineer those opportunities for them to feel confidence and to share something that they feel good about?
Yeah, I'd like to answer this question as a clinician. And now as a clinician from outside of the school. So as a school psychologist, I was a part of the school, right, in the school system. And as a clinician, I'm an outside contractor coming into the school. And one of the things working with that tier 3, which is really what this question is geared towards, of students, I was intentional or am intentional about there's this idea when you have tier 3 students that when they see you as the support, as a clinician or whomever, fix them, right? Fix them and send them back. And my issue is I am not going to fix a child, first of all, in a 40-minute session. Furthermore, I cannot fix or address a child's need and send them back into a dysfunctional system. So if we're not working to work and change and mold the system that was alluded to many times throughout this conversation, then what I'm doing with this child is not helpful, right? And so I'm intentional about working with the people who are a part of the staff and saying, okay, I can only share so much with you, but here are things you need to look out for, or here are things to help understand the why, right? The function behind the student's behavior. And I know it's aggressive, but what you also don't know is they experience chronic trauma. They've had several things happen this school year alone, right? And so just being aware and mindful and having conversations with families about, okay, we need to help staff understand, what are you able to share? What are you willing to share? You're the expert on your child. You know what's happening outside of here. How do we bring that into this room, right? How do we bring that into this conversation, and helping that be a part of change, right? And understanding a student. And really what I feel like is a thread throughout this entire conversation is bringing the humanity to education. I think we have made this such a systemic or systematic and even highly politicized issue that we've taken away the humanity of the experience for both educators and students and their families. And so I think thinking about the whole child and also thinking about the system in which that child is involved is important in terms of bringing voice of the students, of the families, and then of the other educators in the building who are a part. And so I think what has helped me in my roles is really working collaboratively and thinking about the individual and the system together, and how do we bring those to work together. And so as a school psychologist, I can recall a particular instance where, similar to as Courtney just mentioned, had a number of things going on, right? And it was coming from hospitalization and returning to school. And so I was intentional about staying in touch with the people from the hospital and being intentional about what are the plans that you're putting in place? How do we bring that continuity when they're returning to school? How do we work with family? Parents were overwhelmed, right? And so what supports do you need? And being really intentional about bringing all those systems together so they weren't in silos, right? And trying to navigate those systems by themselves and telling them what things to advocate for. And okay, this is what they're going to tell you the school should do, but here's what the school can actually do. And here's what the process looks like for that. So just being mindful of how do we navigate and do that, bring that bridge together.
Well, I'm excited because of all that's being expressed by my colleagues. I just feel excited because these things need to be said. Like when you were just saying, excuse me, that, when students are sent for tier 2 or tier 3 supports, oftentimes the teacher and school staff think you're going to fix them, which is a complete farce. I mean, just like what was expressed, it's, I'm going to meet with them 40 minutes and you think I'm going to fix them. To me, the whole paradigm of that kind of you sending a child out of your classroom to be fixed or somehow to fix the problem is completely incorrect. It's dysfunctional. And so what I try to teach is this, what has been talked about by my colleagues. We have to work together with our expertise to help adults change their behavior. So, and then you're going to then see the behavior change in your children. Really, that's part of the foundation of like positive behavior intervention supports, right? A lot of times when people look at these programs like PBIS or restorative justice practices or something like that, a lot of educators honestly have in their minds, yeah, I want to change their behavior. I want to fix their behavior. I want to modify their behavior. I know it because I hear a lot of their feedback to me and their frustration. But the reality is what my colleagues have said is this: it starts with us as adults, that I need to start to change the way I communicate, the way I listen, the way I view my students, my community. So I'm excited about that because I feel like it's a challenge, to rather than just say, yeah, we're going to hold kids accountable. What about us look in the mirror and say, I'm going to hold myself accountable to a high standard? And if I'm going to hold a child accountable to a high standard, I'm going to always ask myself, have I truly provided them the supports to reach that standard? Because if I did not provide the supports for that, or my community have not provided the supports, I'm being irresponsible as an educator. And I need to own that, because I'm then setting up children for failure. And so, and I don't mean any disrespect, because I know I'm passionate about this and I don't mean that, but I love children. I love school staff. And I love the parents. I feel like I'm about the community really looking at this in truth, rather than in the farce and the lies that, like, oh, we can just fix a kid because we sent him to some social worker for a few sessions. It's like, come on. Where it's really important is in the relationship in the classroom. That's the teacher student relationship is of such vital importance. It should be the priority in any school. That's where the kids spend their time every day. It's not with me as the social worker, and I have an MSW, but just like has been said, I know I can't fix kids. I need to go back to that teacher and say, I want you to gain some understanding of this student so that you can be more effective in your communication, which is really at the foundation of all relationship, is communication. And then as you build that relationship, you will become more effective as an educator, and you'll find that that student will change their behavior. Now, just one example I wanted to give for this. In one of my training sessions, I was doing a 2-day training, restorative justice practice training. One of the teachers raised their hand, and like in many cases they do for me, they'll say, well, what are you going to do about that student who's like my worst behaved student, and blah blah blah. They kind of try to challenge me that way. And fortunately, I said to the community in the circle, I said, is there anybody that would like to respond? And one of the teachers said, one of the strategies that I use for one of my worst behaved students that I've had was, I decided I had tried all the kind of discipline stuff with them and nothing worked to change their behavior. So she, as a teacher, she decided to invite that student in for lunch with her. And she made a commitment. I'm not going to talk about their behavior, their academics, their attendance, none of that. I'm just going to ask them who they are and what is it that they're passionate about. And I know it sounds strange, but what she then told that other teacher, she said that one lunch that she had transformed their relationship. That student started to behave better. They started to communicate better, and that behavior, that positive behavior, really just took off. So the other teacher tried it, and we came back in one more week for the second session, and she said, I did what the teacher of what she was suggesting, and it worked. So I just want to say our strategies, like a lot of times like what my colleagues have said is, what am I willing to change in myself and in my approach? That is ultimately what is going to be required if we truly want to create a safer school, a better school climate. I mean, that's where the foundation of it is.
So I want to mention too that yes, we understand that when it comes to students with higher needs, especially those who may be experiencing trauma, chronic absenteeism, behavioral challenges, targeted individualized interventions are absolutely necessary. And schools can develop, for example, individualized behavior plans for students who may be facing challenges. They need to be co-created by teachers. So you heard my colleagues talk about that earlier, by teachers, by counselors, and by the students themselves, by the caregivers, to focus not just on discipline, but on teaching students how to understand and negotiate their emotions and how to make positive choices. The plans, though, and this I think goes to Anthony's point just now, also serve as reminders to teachers about what they do and about triggers and steps that teachers and students can take together to avoid escalations. And as you heard my colleagues emphasize, these plans work best when they are supported by a restorative and community building environment, which allows students to be seen, be heard, repair harm, build relationships with peers and staff, rather than simply being punished or removed from the school community or being seen as someone who needs to be fixed, right? And so I agree too. I heard some folks talk a little bit about the most impactful approaches have seen, or that I've seen rather, across schools include multiple agencies and players. This work is way too large, way too difficult, and sometimes requires specialization. And so a comprehensive approach of a caring and supportive community and those individualized mental health counseling supports that are offered by a trained and certified professional for students who may be dealing with trauma, acute emotional challenges, or other specific needs. We need to support the development of the whole healthy child with all of these pieces in place. And so, again, I've talked a lot about partners, but partnering with community-based organizations. In New York City, for example, the Montefiore School Health Program has allowed schools to offer counseling services that are tailored to the unique needs of their students. So if they don't have enough social workers in the building, if they don't have access to other mental health supports, that we're able to do it through these mental health programs. A partnership with NYU has ensured that speech teachers and service providers were trained and well equipped to provide counseling and skill building support to students on the autism spectrum. And then school and community programs team at the Child Mind Institute has been able to bring evidence-based mental health care to high need school communities. And they've offered skill building programs or direct clinical services for students and families. And then professional training for educators and school-based clinicians and other kinds of resources that support caregivers. And so what that does is it allows students who've had or who've experienced community violence, housing instability, or other traumatic and adverse experiences, that they get that trauma-informed therapy that is directly within the school or connected to the school and ensures that the supports are accessible and ongoing. And I think that's something that I heard Dr. Carr talk about too, right? Is that we're not fixing kids in one 40-minute session, that instead we're thinking about developing a whole child over time with supports that are ongoing. And I just wanted to mention, I participated recently in a mental health roundtable that included a number of different youth advocates, and it was facilitated by the SRS Family Foundation and the Child Mind Institute. And we discussed the growing push to bring mental health services into the core of school systems, to normalize what it means to focus on mental health well-being, and to ensure that every child and family has access to equitable trauma-informed interventions. And so we've talked a lot in this session about what defining mental health support can look like in schools, how we can create consistent nurturing environments. And I'm delighted to hear that so many folks are really just talking about the integration of the different kinds of supports and programming that we can create in schools to really set up those environments where kids can thrive.